Hey everybody, Koldar here. Today we are looking at Grand Empress Shek'zeer in Heart of Fear on normal difficulty. So this fight is a 3-phase encounter, and I should mention that we are using 2 tanks, a Brewmaster Monk and a Protection Paladin, and you'll need 2 tanks because of 1 debuff on this fight. And then also we're using 2 healers, myself as a Monk and our Holy Paladin. So you can use 2 or 3 healers depending on your comfort level with the damage. Now, I mentioned this is 3 phases, and these phases, for the most part, are based on time early on. So just basically how much time has occurred. And then later on, the final phase is based on the percent health of the boss. So because of that, if your DPS is high enough, you can actually prevent repeating the second phase, or even the first phase another time. So you'll have to do the first phase twice no matter what. But then the second phase, where you deal with a number of adds, you can skip repeating this if your damage is high enough to push the boss to the final phase before the repeat happens. So that is one thing that is beneficial about using fewer healers, especially if you can get away with it. Your damage will be much higher and potentially skip the second phase again. Anyway, because the fight is split up into these phases, I think for the video the easiest thing to do is to go ahead and go through each phase on its own, talk about them in detail, and then I'll loop back through the entire fight and discuss the transitions and how we're handling things overall. So let's go ahead and get started with the first phase. So as you begin the first phase, you'll just face Grand Empress by herself, and the length of this first phase is always dictated by her energy. So she starts with 150 energy, and this drains at a rate of 1 energy per second. So very simply, the first phase is always 2.5 minutes in length every time. Now there are a few abilities to deal with. The most common, but simplest, is Dread Screech. And this is cast on 2 random raid members every 7 seconds. And it deals around 60,000 physical damage to that target, and anyone within 5 yards of the player. It prefers ranged targets, so the simple solution is to have all your ranged and healers spread apart at least 5 yards, and then they won't AE each other. Pretty easy. And I should mention, I've talked about this before, but even though I'm a healer, as a monk, I'm classified as a melee, so luckily I don't get preferential target selection for those sort of effects, so I can stay in melee here and it's fine. Yay! Anyway, the main ability that you'll deal with for the first phase is Dissonance Field. And you can see one of these fields on the left of my screen. They're very hard to miss. This ability is cast twice per the first phase. So every time you do a 2.5 minute for phase 1, you'll get 2 sets of dissonance fields. Each time it's cast, it will target 2 random raid members, and again it prefers ranged, and spawn a field underneath them. So you can see 2 new fields are spawning in the back top left of the screen there. And these fields work very similar to the collapsing star mechanic from the Algalon the Observer encounter in Old War, if you are familiar with that. If not, essentially the idea is that these spawn on their own, and they will slowly drain their energy or health. In this case, it's energy, even though it looks like a health bar. And after 45 seconds, if you don't do anything to impact the rate at which they drain energy, they will explode. When they explode, they deal around 200,000 physical damage to the entire raid. So if you don't change the rate at which they drain energy from each other, since they spawn simultaneously and drain simultaneously, they'll explode simultaneously and do 400,000 total at the same time, instead of ideally what you want is one of them going off for 200,000 and then a delay until the second one explodes, giving you enough time to heal up that damage from the first explosion beforehand. So, as the fight sort of transitions here, this is still phase 1. It's just a different version of phase 1 that happens later in the fight, but the mechanics are all the exact same. So you can see it's kind of hard to tell, but there's fields in the back there. There's one on the right and one behind the boss directly. So what we're basically doing is forcing the field on my right, the top right of the screen, to drain faster than the one on the top of the screen behind the boss. And this way the one on the right will explode first, and then we'll have enough time to heal up the damage before the one in the back explodes. So, to force the fields to drain faster, you basically have to have a player step into them, and while you're within the radius of the field, any spell cast effects will be absorbed by the field, but drain the energy at the rate of 1 energy per cast. So, you can have a healer step in there and start doing heals, or you can have a ranged DPS step in and just keep nuking on the boss. But while you're in that field, your nukes will be absorbed rather than actually land on their target. And again, I mentioned that even though the fields look like they have a health bar, you can't attack them directly. So instead, you just have to use this absorb effect, and it will cause the energy to drain on its own. Now that said, there is a clever way to do this, in that there's another effect we have to deal with during this first phase called Cry of Terror. So Cry of Terror is cast on a random raid member about every 25 seconds during the first phase only, and it prefers ranged targets. And this player will basically deal AE damage to the entire raid while this effect is active. It does about 44,000 damage every 2 seconds. So hitting 10 players around 220,000 DPS while it's active. Now you can handle this by basically having the player with Cry of Terror utilize the dissonance field, which innately absorbs effects coming from within the field. So therefore, if a player is doing AE damage from Cry of Terror, if they step into the dissonance field, that field will absorb all the AE damage, and therefore it won't deal damage to the raid, and will have the added benefit of lowering the dissonance field energy, just like you want. So, the simplest method for handling dissonance field is to utilize Cry of Terror targets. Basically, at any given moment, one player will have the Cry of Terror, so it was just cast on our Elemental Shaman at this point. And it's sort of hard to see, but in the top left, during the near that back field, you can see our Elemental Shaman is sort of stepping into the field there, right at the edge. So his effects are being absorbed from dissonance field. So my damage in the bottom right, you can see the shadowy absorb icon, and then the value 43,000 and so on. Those are the ticks from Cry of Terror, and they're all being absorbed by the dissonance field. So it works great. Basically, you just have the one player with Cry of Terror step into the dissonance field that you're trying to get lower, and once that field explodes, don't step into the other one, obviously, because you don't want that one to drain any faster. So you'll just have to heal through the Cry of Terror damage after the first field explodes. But it's a great way to get the field to drain faster and reduce the raid damage. So that's pretty much it for the first phase. You basically do this process twice, since there's 2 sets of dissonance fields, and the timing is such that the final field will explode on its own without any help from the raid, just before Grand Empress drains all her energy and transitions out of the phase entirely. So you can see in the top of the screen, the field that's slightly to the right, we are draining that one on purpose. So this one will explode in a moment here. And we're just getting everyone healed up. There we go. And then when this one explodes, then we just wait the remainder of time till the next one goes off. And you can see that there's about 12 seconds left in the phase before she transitions on her own. But the field will explode on its own just before that happens. There it goes. And then a couple seconds later, transition. So it works really well. So that's phase 1. Let's go ahead and check out phase 2. As the second phase begins, the Grand Empress will teleport away, and you'll get 2 sets of ads that will spawn from the far sides of the room and immediately rush toward the raid. There are 4 ads in each set, and it consists of 1 Reaver and 3 Windblades. Now, in my opinion, this is the most difficult phase. We spent most of our time on this by far. But essentially, you have a lot of abilities going on, a lot of ads to deal with, and a set amount of time in which to do it all. So I'll talk about all the abilities that are going on, the method we use to handle it, and then a few alternative methods if you need something different. So the first thing you should know is that throughout this phase, all the ads have the Band of Valor ability, which means that anytime an ad is within at least 8 yards of one or more other ad, they will gain 30% damage dealt, and this stacks. So when they initially spawn, they're in sets of 4. If you keep them that way, and they're within 8 yards of each other, then each of those ads will gain 3 stacks of Band of Valor, or basically deal 90% more damage. So their base damage is not excessively high, on tanks anyway, but with 90% more, it can be somewhat spiky. So one thing we found, it was a good idea for your tanks to save up mitigation resources or even cooldowns for that initial pickup if you do it like we do here, where your tanks each get a set. And that way the initial spike damage before the tanks get in position and get their debuffs active and all that is not as severe. So something to keep in mind there. Anyway, other than that overall ability that all the ads gain throughout, the ad types have their own effects as well. So the Reavers are probably the least dangerous of the ad types, but unfortunately there are only 2 of them, and they have really high health. So for the most part, your damage will not be focused on the Reavers. That said, the first ability they use most frequently is Toxic Slime, and this is a cone attack cast in front of them, so it should only hit the tank. It does around 90,000 nature damage when it hits anyone in that cone, so just face the mob away from the raid and you'll be fine. They also will cast Poison Bomb on 2 random raid members. You might have seen a couple bombs go out just a moment ago. And these basically just do around 50,000 nature damage when they hit, and then they also have a 10-second dot that does nature damage over time to those players. You can't do anything to prevent that damage, and it's pretty minor, so just heal through it, and that's about it. And then finally, they will cast a debuff pretty much constantly on the tank called Poison Drenched Armor. And this is sort of a debuff, but also a benefit. So this does around 20,000 nature damage every second to the tank, so just a minor dot that you have to heal through. But it also has the added benefit of any melee in particular that gets within about melee range of the tank while they have the Poison Drenched Armor will gain a 30-second buff called Poison Fumes. While you're afflicted with Poison Fumes, your melee attacks have a pretty high chance to proc about 50,000 nature damage extra on your target. And this proc rate seems to be about an average of every 3 seconds. So for the 30 seconds that you're buffed with that as a melee, you'll do around 16 or 17,000 extra DPS single target. So it's a really nice benefit for your melee DPS. And they should always keep that active if they can, just by getting close to the tank nearest to them every 30 seconds or so. So that's pretty much it for the Reavers. Let's go ahead and talk about the Windblade. So dealing with the Windblades is definitely the most important aspect of the second phase. Now they don't have very much health, a little over 6 million each, but there are 6 of them, of course. And this second phase is time limited. It's only 2.5 minutes in length at most, after which the boss will come back out and start the first phase again no matter what. So you need to deal with all the ads within that time period. It's also important to note that you can end this phase before the 2.5 minutes expire by killing all 6 Windblades. So you'll notice that we're keeping this final Windblade alive on purpose without killing it because we want to extend the phase duration a little bit longer and help us deal with the Reaver, which I'll talk about in a minute. So just be aware that if you kill all the Windblades prematurely, the phase is going to end on its own, and you may not want to do that. So as for the abilities of the Wind Blades, the first and most important is Fixate. And this is very similar to all Fixate effects. You can see it's on me there, or it was. And basically they will fixate a random raid member and start chasing them, trying to attack them. This Fixate lasts 20 seconds, and it also has the effect of snaring the movement speed of that particular Wind Blade by 75%. So they move very slowly. Because of that, and because they can do pretty spiky melee damage, the best idea is to kite when you get fixated. So here as we start again, you can see a Fixate's on me, and I'm running away. And this is pretty much how you need to do it. So they move so slow you can easily outrun them. And I'm about to die in a moment here, and this is sort of a lesson to pass along. So Fixate ends there after the 20 seconds. But this is pretty common, where the Wind Blade that fixated you will retain threat on you, even after Fixate ends. So in that case, even after Fixate ended, it was still attacking me. And you need to be careful of this. So make sure when you have Fixate and it's ending, you communicate with your tank to taunt and pick up the Wind Blade after the Fixate is over. Now, I also made a mistake myself, where I ran through the Reaver position with that Wind Blade, and therefore gave it the Band of Valor stack that it should not have had. I also tried to stun it with my personal stun, and that means melee range, and I shouldn't have done that either. I should have just kept running away, even after Fixate ends, until the tank could pick it up. So anyway, lesson learned there. The point is, if you get Fixate and it's ending, just keep kiting until your tank can grab it, and then that should be the safest method. You can use snares and things like that on the Wind Blades, but again, if they're attacking you and not a tank, it's because they're fixating for the most part, and therefore they're already pretty slow. Okay, the next ability is just a basic extra melee hit that they'll use, and that's where their spike damage comes from. It's Sonic Blade, and they'll just basically do 150% weapon damage and interrupt your spells. So that was one of the big hits on me when I died earlier, was that effect plus melee hit. So again, just be careful not getting into melee if you can prevent it, and you're, not able to heal through the damage in some way. Okay, the most important ability from Wind Blades is Sticky Resin. And you can see it's actually on our paladin to my right there. But the way Sticky Resin works is it's cast on a random raid member at their location, and after a few seconds, it will basically be picked up off the ground from where they were standing and stick to the player. If it's stuck to you, you take damage over time and you move a little bit slower, but you can move that resin location to a new spot. So if two players with sticky resin attached to them stand in the same location, the resin will drop off both of those players and form a resin puddle at that location. So it's hard to see here, but we're forming a resin puddle at the red marker, which is sort of the right of the screen, the top. There it is there. And then any subsequent resin that you get off the ground, so there's a resin pile to my left on the screen. If you walk over that resin pile, you'll get the resin from it, and then you can take that resin to the existing resin pile. So I'm doing it here. And once you touch an existing resin pile, the resin attaches to that pile and increases the size and the stack count. After doing this 5 times, so the initial 2 people to form the resin pile, and then 3 more people to increase the stack to 5 total, the resin will turn into an amber trap. It's a very big crystal, you can't miss it. And this trap is the key to defeating the Reavers, who have insane amounts of health. So most of your DPS throughout this phase, oh, there's the trap there. So you can see the Reaver was pulled onto the trap, and it's now entombed in the amber. This amber basically does 5% of the health of the mob every 2 seconds forever. The only exception is if the amber trap is killed. And the way it can be killed is the wind blades will automatically attack it. You can see the wind blade there attacking it. So they'll automatically try to kill it. And if they do so, then they can break out the Reaver before the amber trap finishes it off. But if you're handling the wind blades properly and killing them first, chances are there won't be enough of them to kill the trap in a timely manner. So the basic goal here is to utilize resin to create 2 unique traps at a specific location, and then use those traps to trap the Reavers, at which point they will be killed on their own from the trap damage. You don't have to do it yourself. So we have 2 raid markers somewhat near the front of the room where the boss is, red and yellow in this case. And those are the locations that we're dropping resin. So when we initially engage the phase, as we're doing here, we basically choose a set of wind blades for one of the tanks to focus our DPS on. So in this case, we're attacking the ones from the left that are sort of in front of me now. And the purpose of this is to make sure that all the wind blades on a given tank are dead by the time we get enough resin for a trap. This way we won't be in danger of accidentally trapping a wind blade when the tank runs over with the Reaver. If it has another wind blade attacking the tank, then obviously you have potential for trapping the wind blade instead and wasting the trap. So instead we focus the wind blades for the tank on the left first, and this way by the time we get our first resin created, we can just have it assigned to the Reaver only and not have to worry about it. So we're just running our resin in there, and once it gets to 5 and traps, creates a trap, then our tank will run the Reaver over there. Meanwhile, we have to be sure not to kill all the wind blades that are remaining. So we're going to leave one of them high health, which tends to be whichever one's the highest health on the other tank, the tank on the right in this case. So there's the wind blade we're leaving alone. And so there's a trap, and we run it over, and now we don't have to attack that Reaver anymore. It'll just die from the trap damage on its own. So then we drop our resin on the second marker location right next to it, which in this case is the yellow marker. And we should just get enough resin to form a second trap around the time that the phase is ending. We did make a mistake and drop a couple resin back a little bit. And this is because you can see here I'm fixated, but then I also get a resin on me. And I don't want to move over to the resin pile and have the fixate pull the wind blade into that trap if I happen to be the 5th resin stack, and therefore it traps right away. So I'm just playing it safe and staying far away. And I can't really stun it or anything like that because it's immune while it's fixating. So unfortunately I just have to run around and wait for someone else to get the resin. And then I step over the thing here, which I wasn't supposed to do. But we have extra resin, so it's not a big deal. The point is, once you get that trap formed, there it is, you pull the final Reaver over it, and then kill off the existing wind blade just as the phase is transitioning. And you can just leave the Reaver in the trap. He'll die on his own. So that really covers most of everything in phase 2, how to handle the ads. Again, the point is to focus wind blades down so that you lower damage on the tanks, and then allow one of the tanks to have a Reaver that they can be certain will hit the trap. Now, if you want, you can form 2 resin traps, have them up simultaneously without moving a Reaver into them, and then only move the Reavers in when you're ready to transition. So you'll have one wind blade alive while you're waiting for the final resin to be applied. And then once 2 traps are formed, kill the wind blade, and as the boss is spawning, pull both Reavers into their assigned traps simultaneously. And that will work fine too. There's no reason you can't do it that way. We just chose to focus wind blades on one side first, and that worked okay. Now, another method for handling this phase is to basically kite the wind blades with a tank and have a second tank handle just the two reavers by themselves. We tried this a few times. Wasn't that great for us. It seemed much more stable to just deal with the extra damage on the tanks and heal through it rather than spend all this time kiting. The problem with the kite method is that your DPS tends to be lower because your tank can't really sustain very much threat while they are kiting. But that said, it does lower the damage taken by the tanks severely because the wind blades will basically just be running around constantly, especially if you can snare them often. You need to make sure if you do the kite method that your fixate targets are running the same basic path that your tank is running as well, so that they don't get separated. And this way, once threat is comfortable and you can start AEing on the wind blades, that, it will hit all of the targets, basically. But I recommend just normal splitting them just like you would any set of trash and handling it that way. All right, so let's move on to the final phase, which is phase 3, and it starts at 30% health for Grand Empress. So you won't see the transition right now until we go back through the fight, but just assume that it's starting at 30% of her health. So as the third phase begins at 30% health, you want to immediately have your raids stack up behind the boss. And this is to increase your healing effects that you'll get. Now, there are a lot of abilities going on in this phase, and pretty much all of them are some form of damage. So the healing requirement on this phase is very, very high, and this is where you want to use all your cooldowns, bloodlust, all that good stuff, just to get through the phase faster. That said, it's pretty simple mechanically, so if you can handle the damage output, then you should be able to get through the phase in only a couple tries. So I'll just go ahead and start going through the list of abilities that are going on here, talk about what they all do and how they work together a little bit. So to begin, I should mention that all the effects pretty much on this phase cast by the Empress have sort of a minimum cooldown, but unlike a lot of encounters where the ability is always used on that set cooldown and it alternates with other effects, in this case, the ability cooldowns can conflict with each other, and therefore if one ability is occurring at the same time another ability should happen because of the cooldown, the second ability that was not cast will simply not happen at that moment, and it will be delayed another X amount of seconds until the next cooldown occurs. So this can kind of change the timing of things a little bit. For the most part, it doesn't really matter because you're just going to be dealing with all these various effects that do damage and healing through it, but just be aware that it changes the timing of damage spikes a little bit. So the first ability is Shaw Energy, and this is just cast on 2 random raid members. It does around 55,000 shadow damage to those players, so not a huge amount. But again, it's cast very randomly, so it can be anywhere from about 8 to 15 seconds, depending on the ability usage of other effects. The next ability is one she just used there, called Consuming Terror, and this is a cone attack that is targeted toward a random raid member. So because most of your raids should be stacked behind the boss at any given moment, it's generally just going to be toward the raid. But it's a 4-second cast, and therefore it's very easy to sidestep the cone attack and get out of it. If it hits you, it does massive shadow damage and will fear that player for about 8 seconds, although this fear can be dispelled. So you can see there's the cone, very easy to see, and you just sidestep out of the way and move to the other side of the boss. So just repeat that process. Now, while that is casting, as I mentioned, any other ability cooldowns that are happening will just be skipped entirely and then be delayed until the next cooldown is available. So just be aware of that. Next up, we have Amassing Darkness. And this ability, I can't say for certain, but I think it's either bugged or just simply doesn't work as is written in the dungeon journal. So this effect is supposed to do damage to one player, and then every 2 seconds add another player to the list of players that it does damage to until it's hitting everyone in the raid. However, in our experience, even though it was cast every 6 seconds, pretty much like clockwork, it never hit more than 2 targets. So I don't know if that's a bug or they just changed the way it's supposed to work. But essentially it means it's not nearly as dangerous as you would think it would be based on the description. So it's just some random raid damage that happens every 6 seconds or so. And again, you have to heal through it. Next, we have Visions of Demise. So many things going on. So this is a debuff cast on 2 random raid members. And basically they're marked with red arrows. After 4 seconds, you can see an arrow on the left, one of our shamans there. After 4 seconds, that player will get a new debuff with the same effect. It's called Visions of Demise. But this basically does AE damage around that player every 1 second to anyone that's in about 8 yards of them. And they'll be feared with a magic dispellable fear. So the easiest way to handle this is, since your raid is stacked up to benefit your healing, simply have the player with Visions of Demise step out of the raid. So you can see 2 players are running out, our shamans on the right there. And after 4 seconds, they'll get the converted ability, which will start doing AE damage and fear them. And your healers should just instantly dispel those players, at which point they'll lose the AE effect and they can come back to the raid and proceed with the fight. So pretty simple. Now technically they don't need to run out. You can just have them stay in the raid, but every second that passes before you happen to dispel means, 25,000 damage to everybody. So not recommended. I would just have them run out after 4 seconds and then get dispelled. Pretty simple. So the final ability that you'll deal with is called Calamity. And this one will probably deal the most damage of anything throughout the phase. But it's got a unique mechanic, and it's not quite as dangerous as it seems. So this is cast pretty much every 6 seconds. Again, it can be delayed if other effects are happening at the same time, but plan every 6 seconds. Basically, this hits everyone in the raid, and it does damage equal to 50% of their current health at the time that it hits. So, obviously, if everyone's full health, I have 400,000 health or so. So when I'm full health, it does around 200,000 damage to me every 6 seconds. But if I don't get healed and I stay at 200,000, then the next hit, of course, does half of my current health, or only 100,000. So while it can be difficult to think of it in this term, you really want to keep players not at full health throughout this phase because of that. Otherwise, you're simply taking more damage from Calamity every 6 seconds, and then therefore healing more than you need to. Now, you have to balance it because all those other effects that I mentioned that do base damage values and tend to randomly target people can be dangerous if you leave people at too little health. So the point here is that Calamity will never kill anybody. Since it always does 50% of your current, you can't ever die from that hit. But you can die if you're too low and another effect hits you. So ideally, you should keep people around, maybe 50 to 70% health, so that any 2 random effects on a player don't have the potential to kill them outright, but Calamity doesn't do quite as much damage. Okay, so that's phase 3. Let's go ahead and loop back through, and we'll go through the whole fight in one fell swoop and see how it goes. So as we begin the fight one more time, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that depending on your raid makeup and therefore your DPS, you can potentially skip repeating the second phase, basically. So as you now know, because the third phase begins at 30% health, when you do the first phase for the first 2.5 minutes, you want to try to do at least 35% of the boss's health in that 2.5 minute period. Therefore, when you repeat the first phase the second time, if you can do the same damage value, you'll do at least a total of 70%, and therefore transition her into the third phase before she repeats phase 2 one more time. So just try to figure out ways to maximize your DPS so that you can do at least that 35% per phase 1. So you can see here that we're just continuing to focus down the dissonance fields as they spawn. Again, we're choosing the leftmost dissonance field, generally speaking, or the one closest to the boss if they're sort of the same radius position. And then once that explodes, just heal up the damage and wait for the next one. Obviously, raid-wide cooldowns, damage mitigations are good for the explosions. Especially just be ready if a player looks like they're low health just before it's going off. I tend to save for Mistweavers anyway, my revival cooldown for that situation if it looks like people are not going to be able to get topped off in time. And it's just a nice instant heal for everyone. Other than that, this first phase, very simple. Not a lot to happen. I don't know if I mentioned there's a tank debuff anytime you're attacking the Grand Empress. That's basically the reason you need 2 tanks. It's pretty simple. If the tank gets 5 stacks, they get charmed. You don't want that, so we just swap your tanks every 3 or 4 stacks, and that's pretty simple. Not much to it. So we're approaching the end of the phase, and we've exploded the third dissonance field, and now we're just letting the last one explode on its own. Again, this will go off just before the phase transitions, so you don't have to actually manually affect the timing on it. And heal up that damage, and then she's going to port out. There she goes. So immediately our tanks split off into their assigned locations and pick up the adds. And one tip is, because the spike damage on tanks tends to be pretty high, you may want to split your healing assignments a little bit. So generally speaking, I was healing our monk tank and our paladin was healing our paladin tank. Pretty simple. And then once things are a little more stable, especially as the wind blades tend to start fixating and get out of range, then the damage will go down quite a bit. And I've talked about how we chose to attack the wind blades on the leftmost tank first. And this was just done because we wanted to make sure one Reaver was clear of all wind blades by the time we got our first trap. But if you find that damage on your second tank using this method is still too high, because they'll still pretty much always have 3 or 4 mobs attacking them, then there's no reason you can't split your damage. So basically have half your DPS attack wind blades on the left and half the ones on the right. And this way the overall damage done to both tanks will remain about the same and go down pretty quickly. So that's one possible method. Otherwise, you can see we're just kind of getting resin stacked up in our first marker. And once that's trapped, then the next resins are going to the other marker. So you can see our paladin and our shadow priest are going to the yellow. And the trap is noticed by the wind blade there, but by himself he can't possibly break it in time, so don't really have to worry about it. And you can attack the Reaver if you don't have anything else to do, but it's pretty much wasted damage because you're going to use the traps once it forms. So we're just kind of hanging around, regenerating our mana, all that good stuff. And I mentioned here I would run in with this resin, but I don't want the wind blade to run over the trap and waste it. Something you need to be careful of. That's also a good tip, is just during this phase while you're kiting wind blades, make sure you run them in a pattern that is nowhere near your trap location, so that you don't accidentally trap a wind blade when you don't intend to. And there's a resin puddle I should not have made, but it doesn't matter, we have enough resin anyway. And so now our tank is running the final Reaver over as our other tank picks up the boss. And this is pretty handy because if you get rid of your Reaver just before the boss transitions, then your tank that was on the Reaver will retain the armor-drenched debuff for that full 2 minutes after the Reaver stops attacking them. So this can be a lot of extra damage for your melee DPS especially. So just keep in mind that they should try to keep that active on themselves every 30 seconds until the debuff falls off. So in our case, it's on our Paladin tank there for quite a while. And that'll help you burn through this second version of Phase 1 that you'll go through here. And so again, our goal here is just to get the boss down to 30%, but not so quickly that we still have dissonance fields active while we're in the third phase. So the timing is a little bit tricky. We cut it somewhat close. It's fine, as you'll see, but one thing you can do is on the second set of dissonance fields, have the first dissonance field get extra reductions so that it explodes very early, maybe even using an extra person to step in there and cast a few spells. And then once that explodes and you heal up, then do the same thing on the second dissonance field. Force that one to explode early as well. This way you can push the boss's health earlier than you would be able to if you just wait for that final fourth field to explode on its own. That said, you can do it that way, which is what we do here. But as you'll see, the timing is a little bit close. So we basically stop dot damage around 34, 35%. And then we just use single target damage to get her pretty low, around 31. And then wait for the dissonance field to explode or nearly explode before we call for a DPS push. So you can see the energy draining there, 13 seconds, 12 seconds, and she's got about 1% left. And there's the field, so then we call for DPS to burn her. And she's transitioned. She does it a little bit above 30%. You can see she transitioned around 30.5. So there's a little bit of a gap there. Anyway, so once we've pushed her into the final phase, we all stack up behind her immediately. And right away, 2 people get the Visions debuff. So just be ready to dispel that quickly. And then you'll have to sidestep the cone attack. But obviously that's easy to do. And then just keep positioning her properly. We didn't really turn her as we should have done here. Our tank should have turned her so that we're attacking her back, obviously. But minor stuff, I guess. And really, we're just stacking up to increase healing and using our raid cooldowns, bloodlust, and all that good stuff. And just trying to burn her down. Really, once you get used to the timing of Calamity every 6 seconds, it's not as dangerous as it seems. I mentioned before that Calamity itself can't kill you, so it seems like a lot more damage is happening that is dangerous than it really is. And once you get a little bit of practice on this phase, you'll notice that it's not as scary as it seems to be. But yeah, so I'm just trying to basically heal efficiently as I can here. And our poor paladin has been low on mana for a while. But he's just trying to sustain whatever he can as well. And that's pretty much it. So that's Grand Empress Shek'zeer. Good luck, and thanks for watching.